there's only one true purpose of government, and that's to protect our rights. We need to look no further than the Declaration of Independence for evidence or proof of this. The Declaration of Independence states that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We the people form the government by giving up, through our own consent, some of our rights and some of our property. A purest example of this is fire and police services. We give up some of our property in terms of taxes, and in return, we get the security provided by police and fire protection. If we acknowledge that the Constitution is the foundation of our government, we know that it must always be adhered to. I have a background in construction, and my grandfather's here today. He had a construction business, so he taught me from a very early age that any building with a weak foundation is at risk. And we've neglected our foundation. And it's going to be up to us to repair that foundation, which is the Constitution, and ensure that it's adhered to. I think the answer to this question lies squarely with the people. There should be, and there must be, a mechanism to recall any elected official who fails to uphold the duties of their office. Yes, I'm not ashamed to say that I'm afraid of this government and I do not trust it. Our founding fathers had a similar fear, and they left us with the Fourth Amendment to protect us against unreasonable searches and seizures. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I stand firmly behind the Second Amendment of the Constitution. It's important today as the day it was written. And when I lived in Trinidad and Tobago, I can tell you this. There were people, criminals, who had access to weapons and guns. And the citizens could not get guns, and they lived in fear. I will not allow that to happen in the United States of America. I cannot give you an assurance that I would vote against any defense budget while our troops are in harm's way. I believe firmly in our armed forces and in peace through strength strategy. I stand firmly behind our troops, and I believe that we should give them every resource necessary. If we put them in harm's way, they need to have every resource at their disposal to make sure that they complete the mission and return home safely to their families. Yes, placing U.S. troops under the United Nations command undermines U.S. sovereignty.
That's right.
When I, and when many of you enlisted into the military, voluntarily enlisted into the military, you swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States of America, not to protect and defend the Charter of the United Nations. Yes, I would support the U.S. withdrawal from the United Nations, and based on a couple of grounds. Number one, I told you already, we're broke. We can't afford to continue to support the United Nations. The United Nations budget is $5 billion for their regular budget, $5 billion for their peacekeeping budget. 22% of that money comes from the United States. That's $2.2 billion from the United States, from you and I as taxpayers. That doesn't include the funds for UNICEF and the World Food Organization and those functions. I believe that the United Nations undermines our sovereignty as a nation and threatens us. For example, the Law of the Sea Treaty, which sets a precedent for international taxation of U.S. companies, and also requires U.S. companies to be forced into mandatory dispute resolution. I also fear that the United Nations leads us closer towards a one world government. And if you think that's a conspiracy theory, go to the internet, look up the reports. CBS last year, 2009, reported the United Nations proposed a global currency. And if that's not enough proof to get, or reason to get out of the United Nations, yesterday, the United Nations appointed the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, to the UN Council on the status of women.
Isn't that hilarious?
It's ridiculous.
I love that.
Maybe he wants to learn how not to stone women in the streets. I don't know. But if that's not enough reason, we need to get out. Yes, I would support ending the Federal Reserve's monopoly on currency and legal tender, and restore honest money, which will resist inflation. If you look at the American Institute for Economic Research, you can see charts there that show the devaluation of our dollar since 1913 and the creation of the Fed. And you can also look at the Federal Reserve's own website, the St. Louis Fed website, and I can give that to you if you're interested, that shows the increase, the spike in the monetary base in last year's cycle. So yes, definitely this is something that we need to do in terms of restoring honest money in America. If we're not going to end the Fed, at the very least, we need to audit the Fed. We need to know who is behind the curtain and how they're manipulating our financial system. I believe the greatest threat to our nation is not an external threat, it's an internal one. The accumulation of debt that will shackle future generations is our greatest threat. There's three logical steps that or actions that the government can take to alleviate this debt. We could cut spending, we could raise taxes, or we can print money. The Fed has increased our monetary base by printing money, electronically, but it's still the same point. This devalues the currency, and it makes every dollar you have worth less through inflation, and that's, again, a hidden tax. At the height of our financial crisis, if you want, the financial crisis, the Fed posted record profits. Now, I'm not Hillary Clinton, and I'm not against profits. But, I told you before, if you have a principled view on something, it needs to remain a principled view whether your party's in power or not. And I can remember Democrats going after the insurance companies and the oil companies and the financial firms for profits. But they were mysteriously silent when the Federal Reserve posted record profits during one of our greatest economic crises in the last 100 years. Let's pull back the curtain and see who's behind the Fed. Yes, I would support that. With regard to the roll call votes, because you also asked about the roll call votes, again, I would support that as well. I think we need more roll call votes in general. Representatives should be willing to stand in front of their constituents and voice their vote.
Yes.